In official reports, they were called the perfect surgical instrument, created for a quick 3-month mission. But in reality, they were designed as a disposable weapon. Their real mission wasn't to win. Their mission was to burn to ashes, following orders. In this film, we will show how the command, step by step, turned 3,000 of America's best volunteers into the walking dead, only to cold-bloodedly leave them to die once the objective was achieved. This is a story of a military feat that turned into a betrayal. Out of the entire unit, only 130 men were left standing, but there were no plans to bring even them home. They had captured the airfield. They had completed a mission that seemed impossible. The contract, signed 3 months ago in exchange for their lives, had been fulfilled. Now, they were waiting for evacuation, waiting for the planes that would carry them out of this green hell. But instead of planes, an order came. It came over the radio. A dry, soulless voice from the headquarters of General Joseph Vinegar Joe Stilwell. The order was short, and it was a death sentence. Capture the city of Myatkina. Colonel Charles Hunter, listening to the crackle in his headset, felt a cold chill run through him. The city, assault a fortified city. His men were walking corpses. They had no strength, no heavy weaponry for urban combat. This was madness. This was a slaughter. He looked at his soldiers, sleeping scattered across the runway, and understood. He betrayed us. For General Stilwell, sitting in his headquarters hundreds of miles away, everything was perfectly simple. The goal is close. I can't stop out of pity. They are soldiers. Their job is to die if it's necessary for victory. Myatkina will be taken, at any cost. The airfield is just the beginning. I need the city. Stilwell was obsessed with this goal. Myatkina was his personal crusade, and the Marauders were his battering ram. He had smashed the gates with this ram, and now he didn't care that the ram had shattered into pieces. He demanded that the splinters continue to fight. When he was informed of the monstrous losses and the unit's complete exhaustion, that out of almost 3,000 men, less than a handful remained on their feet, Stilwell uttered a phrase that would go down in history, a phrase that became an epitaph for thousands of his soldiers. I'll get them out of Burma, only when they are dead. For the soldiers who heard the new order, this was the moment of truth, the moment the last illusion shattered. The promise to bring them home in 3 months was a lie. Their elite status was a lie. They had been used, squeezed dry to the last drop, and then simply discarded like an empty shell casing. They weren't heroes. They were expendable. A disposable tool that had broken, but was being ordered to keep working. In that moment, something inside their souls broke. The last spark of hope that had driven them forward was extinguished. They realized that no one was coming to save them, that there was only one way out of this hell, through death. They weren't betrayed by the enemy. They were betrayed by their own command. The man who sent them here saw them not as people, but as numbers in a casualty report, and he was ready to write them all off, down to the last man, just to put a pin on his map. They got up, checked their weapons, and went to attack the city. No longer for victory, not for glory. They were going to die, because they had been left no other choice. They were created for lightning strikes from the jungle, for ambushes, for flanking maneuvers. But they were thrown into the most horrific meat grinder, positional warfare for a city. It was like trying to cut steel with a scalpel. The Japanese had turned every house in Myatkina into a fortress, every intersection into a kill zone, and the Marauders, who had neither tanks nor artillery, had to storm these fortresses with their own bodies, and the wounded began to pour in, not in a thin trickle like before, but in a river of blood. The field hospital was set up on the edge of the captured airfield. It was a few tents, constantly under mortar and artillery fire. Here, in this hell within a hell, Dr. George Plain waged his own war. He and his handful of medics hadn't slept for days. Their hands were elbow-deep in blood. Their faces were gray with exhaustion. I'm running out of bandages. I'm running out of morphine. I'm running out of strength. I'm amputating a 19-year-old kid's leg by the light of a flashlight, while a medic tries to hold him down and shells explode outside. I know that as soon as I'm finished, they'll bring me 3 more. This isn't medicine. It's a conveyor belt of death. Around the operating table, knocked together from crates, men lay. They lay on the ground, on stretchers, in the mud. They moaned. They gasped. They called for their mothers. Some were silent, staring at the canvas ceiling. The air was thick with the smell of blood, antiseptics, and death. Every time a shell exploded nearby, the tent would shudder, dirt would fall from the ceiling, and the wounded would flinch. Lying here was more terrifying than being in combat. Out there, you could do something. You could shoot, you could run, you could hide. Here, you were helpless. You just lay there and waited, either for the doctor, who might save your life by taking your leg, or for the next shell, which would end it all in a single blow. Dr. Plain worked on, ignoring the explosions. He moved from one wounded man to the next, his decisions swift and brutal. This one, morphine and wait. This one, shrapnel in the gut, no chance. This one, amputation, now. He was no longer a doctor. He was a sorter in a death factory, trying to snatch a few intact parts from the assembly line. At night, when the shelling subsided, he would step out of the tent. All around, as far as the eye could see, lay rows of bodies covered with ponchos. Every day, there were more of them. He would look at these silent rows and understand that he was losing his war. He could patch up their bodies, but he couldn't bring back the souls they had left behind on the streets of that damned city. This hospital under fire was the final circle of hell for those who had already passed through all the others. By July 1944, the 5,307th Composite Unit had effectively ceased to exist. It was still listed in headquarters reports, but on the streets of Myatkina, it was gone. As a fighting unit, it had been destroyed, not by the enemy, but by its own command. The fight for the city was now being waged by fresh units that had arrived at the captured airfield. New soldiers, full of strength, in clean uniforms. They looked at the handful of surviving marauders with a kind of superstitious horror. We were told there were heroes here, but we see ghosts. They don't talk. They just stare into space. It's terrifying to think what they've been through. And those who survived were no longer fighting. They were just living out their days, sitting in their foxholes on the outskirts of the city, filthy, overgrown, suffering from disease, starvation, and complete psychological collapse. Their war was over, but they weren't being let go. One of the last marauders left standing sat in his mud pit and watched the endless rain. I don't even know what we're fighting for anymore. For this city? For General Stilwell? I'm just sitting here, waiting for it to end. I don't care how. A bullet, disease, or an order that will never come. They were broken, physically and mentally. The promise of evacuation, which at first was a beacon of hope and then a symbol of betrayal, had now become a cruel, mocking joke. They had lost faith in their command, in victory, in life itself. Corporal Herman Puller, one of the few who could still form a coherent thought, tried to describe it in a letter home. This isn't just trees and vines. It's a green hell that's trying to devour you. It clings to your clothes, drinks your sweat, infects your blood, and drives you mad. It has devoured almost all of my friends, and soon it will devour me. The unit, which began its journey with nearly 3,000 of America's best volunteers, had melted away. By the end of the battle for Myitkyina, only 130 men capable of holding a weapon were left standing. 130 out of 3,000. The rest were killed, wounded, or evacuated with malaria, dysentery, typhus, and combat exhaustion. Each of those 130 was the last soldier, the last representative of his platoon, his company, his battalion. He carried within him the memory of hundreds of fallen comrades. He was a living monument to the greatest feat and the greatest betrayal. He sat in his pit, watched the rain, and waited. But the war would not let him go. It was already inside him, and it stayed with him forever. On August 10th, 1944, a week after Myitkyina had finally fallen, the last order came. Not for evacuation, not for commendation. It was an order of disbandment. In the dry language of army bureaucracy, it sounded simple. The unit has completed its objective and has sustained unacceptable losses. From an efficiency standpoint, it no longer exists. Disband, transfer personnel, close the file. For the surviving marauders, it was the final blow. They were simply erased. No one said, "Thank you." No one formed them up one last time to shake their hands. They weren't sent home as promised. They weren't even sent to the rear for rest. Those who remained, about 200 men, including those released from hospitals, were simply mixed in with new recruits from the 475th Infantry Regiment. As if they had never existed, Colonel Charles Hunter, their last commander, stood and watched as his men, his broken, sick warriors, were blended with pink-cheeked youths freshly arrived from the States. He watched as their unique brotherhood, forged in the hell of the jungle, disappeared. At that moment, he knew their feet would be buried in archives under the classified stamp, buried in the unmarked graves of Burma, buried in the broken souls of the survivors. There were no parades, no newspaper headlines, no recognition. They were created as a provisional unit, and when their time was up, they were simply erased, as if 3,000 men hadn't walked 1,000 miles of hell, as if they hadn't accomplished the impossible, as if hundreds of them hadn't given their lives for that damned airfield. In the official history of the war, their mission was called a resounding success. They opened the way for the construction of the Ledo Road. They secured the air corridor to China. They fulfilled their strategic objective. The price of success was not mentioned in the report. The soldier who dreamed of returning home a hero was now just a nameless infantryman in a new regiment. He was asked where he had fought before. He replied, "In the 5307th. The new recruit shrugged, uncomprehending. He had never heard of such a unit. And in that moment, the marauder realized his war wasn't over. It had just become invisible. He had returned from it, but his heroism remained there in the jungle, disbanded and forgotten. The war ended. The world celebrated victory. But for the surviving marauders, it never ended. They returned home, but they brought the jungle back with them. It lived in their blood, in their dreams, in their souls. Their bodies were destroyed. Chronic malaria caused fever attacks for the rest of their days. Amoebic dysentery left scars on their internal organs. Their nervous systems were frayed to the breaking point. But the invisible wounds were the most terrifying. What would later be called post-traumatic stress disorder. Nightmares in which they relived Worm Hill or the assault on Myitkyina over and over again. flashes of rage, an inability to be in a crowd, a sense of alienation from a world that could not understand what they had been through. Society wanted to move on, to build a peaceful life, to forget the horrors of war. No one wanted to hear their stories. Why dredge up the past? Why remember one of 1,000 tragic stories? You're alive. Be happy. But one man could not be happy and could not forget. Colonel Charles Hunter, their last commander. Having survived Burma, he began his second war, a war against indifference, against oblivion, a war for the honor of his soldiers. He wrote letters to Congress, to the Department of the Army, to the President. He demanded recognition. He demanded that the country know the truth. In his memoirs, which he simply titled Galahad, he ruthlessly described everything that had happened. He spared no one, especially General Stilwell. They used us, he wrote again and again, squeezed us dry, and then just threw us away. We were considered expendable. His voice was the voice of conscience. He did not rest until he succeeded. Thanks to his efforts, the unit was awarded the Presidential Unit Citation, the highest collective award a military unit can receive. It was a small victory, but for many, it was not enough. The years passed. The survivors grew old. They raised children, worked in factories and offices, trying to live normal lives. But every night, in the silence, they returned to Burma. They heard the screams of the wounded. They smelled the rotting foliage. And they asked themselves the same question, over and over. Why were we betrayed? Their war after the war was a quiet one, a lonely one, without gunshots or orders. It was a struggle to ensure their sacrifice was not in vain, a struggle to ensure their story was not erased from the pages of history. Charles Hunter fought this battle until his death in 1991. He did not live to see the day his country would finally, fully recognize what his men had done. But he lit a fire that could no longer be extinguished. The year 2020. 76 years have passed, almost a lifetime. The world has changed beyond recognition. Almost everyone who remembered that war is gone. The generals, the politicians, the journalists have died. Almost all who once called themselves Merrill's Marauders have died. But the story they tried to bury in the archives proved stronger than oblivion. It was passed down by word of mouth, from fathers to sons, from veterans to historians. And one day, it reached the halls of the United States Congress. And so, in the twilight of their long, difficult lives, came recognition, the highest recognition a country can bestow, the Congressional Gold Medal, an award bestowed upon George Washington, Nelson Mandela, and Mother Teresa. Now it was being presented to them, the ghosts of the jungle. The ceremony was quiet, without fanfare. Their descendants sat in the hall, the children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren of those who did not survive, and them, a few old men in wheelchairs. They were nearly 100 years old. Their hands trembled. Their hearing was failing. But their eyes, for a moment, that same fire flashed in their eyes. One of the last veterans, a stooped old man, held the heavy gold disc in his hands, the highest civilian award of the country for which he had fought through hell when he was 20 years old. He looked at the medal and his lips whispered, "Too late. Too late for most of the boys. But it's good the country finally remembered. We did what we had to do. We just did our job." For the descendants accepting the award for their fathers and grandfathers, it was not just a piece of metal. It was justice restored. It was the official acknowledgement that their sacrifice was not in vain, that their suffering was not forgotten. It was a justice that had taken almost 80 years to arrive. They were created as a disposable weapon, meant to burn out without a trace. But their resilience proved stronger than steel. Their heroism outlived their betrayers, and the gold they received in their twilight years was not an award. It was an apology, a nation's apology to 3,000 of its finest sons, whom it had once cold-bloodedly sent to die. Their story is not just a lesson in tactics, it is an eternal reminder of the true cost of victory, and that even the most cynical betrayal cannot silence the truth forever. 1944, Burma. Brigadier General Frank Merrill leans over a map, a green, formless patch of jungle, crisscrossed by the thin threads of rivers. He knows this land. He speaks the languages of its enemies, and he understands that the numbers in the staff reports have nothing to do with the reality awaiting his men out there, in that greenness. His task is to carry out the order with the minimum possible losses. But in these jungles, the very concept of minimum losses sounds like a mockery. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away, a rumor spreads across all fronts of the Pacific and the Caribbean. A secret call to arms. Volunteers needed for a dangerous and risky mission. The requirements are high. Only soldiers with combat experience, those who have already fought on Guadalcanal in New Guinea or endured grueling service in Panama. For thousands of young men, tired of garrison routine, this was a chance to break free from the swamp of trench warfare, a chance to join the elite, to prove themselves, to become part of something great. It was an opportunity to end the war quickly and return home a hero. That is exactly what they were promised. The promise was simple and seductive, like a deal with the devil. Just 3 months, 90 days behind enemy lines. Complete the mission and go home. To clean sheets, hot food, and women. 3 months of hell in exchange for eternal glory. The deal seemed more than fair. On paper, in classified dispatches, this operation looked flawless. The project was codenamed Galahad. Command in Washington saw it as a brilliant example of a new American doctrine. We are creating a perfect surgical instrument, a light, mobile unit capable of delivering precise, lethal strikes into the very heart of the enemy's defense. No heavy artillery, no tanks, only men, mules, and radios connecting them to the sky, from which everything they needed would come. They would be ghosts, elusive avengers who appear from nowhere and vanish into thin air. The best answered the call. 2,997 officers and enlisted men. These were not green recruits. They were hardened veterans who had already tasted blood and the bitterness of loss. They thought they knew what they were signing up for. They were wrong. No battle in their past had prepared them for what awaited. They did not yet know that in the staff plans, their unit had a footnote. Provisional. They did not know that the doctrine for their use was copied from the British Chindits, units that were considered disposable. And they had no idea that the promise to bring them home in 3 months was merely a recruitment tool, a cynical calculation designed to gather 3,000 lives to accomplish a single objective. Their real mission was not to win. Their mission was to burn out completely, clearing the path, to become a battering ram that would break the Japanese defense and then be written off and forgotten. In August of 1943, America was creating the perfect weapon. But no one told the soldiers that after a single shot, this weapon would be thrown away. On February 24th, 1944, they took their first step from India into Burma, a step onto the Ledo Road, a scar of mud and stone carved through impassable jungle. With that step, the bravado ended. and hell began. The first enemy they faced wasn't the Japanese. It was the air itself. Thick, heavy, saturated with moisture, it clung to the skin, clogged the lungs, and turned every breath into a struggle. Then there was the earth. Impassable, viscous mud that sucked at their boots and drained their strength. They marched in an endless snake, 3,000 men and 700 mules, up the slopes of mountains the locals called the Ridge of Skeletons. A soldier raised in Brooklyn or Chicago was ready for a fight. He was ready for gunfire, for an enemy in a uniform, for the roar of artillery. But he wasn't ready for the land itself to try and kill him every hour, every minute. Clothing never dried. The skin beneath it festered, rotted alive. Every night, leeches. They were everywhere, in boots, under clothes, in sleeping bags. They fell from the trees like rain. You'd pull off a dozen, and an hour later, hundreds would be in their place. But they were being watched, quietly, silently. Scouts from the Kachin tribe, who hated the Japanese, glided through the undergrowth like shadows. They looked at these big, strong, well-armed Americans and saw them as children. Loud, clumsy children, doomed to die. They left a trail like a herd of bison. They got sick from water the Kachin had drunk their whole lives. They died from insect bites the Kachin paid no mind to. One of the guides would later say, "These Americans are strong, but they don't know the jungle. Without us, they are blind children walking to certain death." Soon, a second, far more terrifying enemy appeared. An invisible enemy. As Private Robert Passett later recalled, the enemy wasn't just in front of us. The enemy was in the water we drank, in the mosquitoes that bit us, in our own blood. Amoebic dysentery. It cut men down by the battalion. Hardened veterans who had been through hell and back writhed on the ground, crying from unbearable abdominal spasms. It was a humiliation that broke them more than any bullet. Then came malaria. The fever threw them from burning heat to freezing chills. Men became delirious, spoke to the dead, lost their minds. K rations, designed for short operations, couldn't replace the calories burned in this hell. Men began to waste away before their eyes. Their faces grew gaunt, their cheekbones sharp. Their eyes took on that 1,000-yard stare of men who have looked over the edge. The enthusiasm of the first days evaporated. It was replaced by a quiet, animalistic struggle for survival. Every step was a victory. Every day survived, a miracle. The promise of returning home in 3 months now seemed like a cruel joke, a delusion from another, long-forgotten life. They marched deeper into Burma to hunt the ghosts of the Japanese 18th Division. But they didn't notice they were becoming ghosts themselves. Ghosts of the jungle, which devoured their bodies and souls long before the first shot was fired. March 1944. The Walaubum area. They were no longer just survivors, trudging through the mud. They were hunters. Disease and hunger had stripped away everything non-essential, leaving only honed instincts and cold fury. Ahead, bogged down in fighting, the Chinese 38th Division was bleeding out. The Japanese 18th Division, hardened veterans, prepared to close the cauldron. The marauders were given their orders: save the Chinese. Strike where no one expected. To a marauder officer studying the map, the plan was bold and elegant. A frontal assault would have been suicide. They had no artillery, no numerical superiority. But they had something the Japanese didn't. They were ghosts. And ghosts don't knock on the front door. The tactic was simple and deadly. It was called the roadblock pocket. The 2nd Battalion was to do the unthinkable: bypass the Japanese positions through jungle considered absolutely impassable and cut their supply road deep in the rear. Once the Japanese sent reinforcements to break the blockade, the 1st and 3rd Battalions would strike from the flanks, creating a perfect kill zone, a trap with no escape. At night, in total silence, they slithered through the undergrowth like snakes, every step measured, every sound controlled. The mules' muzzles were tied to prevent an accidental bray from giving them away. They took up positions on both sides of the road, becoming part of the landscape, an extension of this rotting, damp earth, and waited. For the Japanese commander on that road, it was the end of the world. His soldiers were moving along the only artery supplying the front, confident in the security of their rear. And in an instant, that artery turned to hell. Fire erupted from the flanks. From a wall of green that had seemed uninhabited, a storm of bullets burst forth from thousands of rifles and dozens of machine guns. They didn't fight by the rules. They appeared from nowhere, hit the supply lines, and vanished. They were impossible to surround, impossible to catch. They weren't soldiers. They were ghosts of the jungle. Years later, analyzing the campaign, Japanese General Tanaka Shinichi would admit, their tactic of deep flanking maneuvers created a constant threat, forcing the diversion of huge forces from the main front. Chaos reigned on that road. The Japanese were trapped. They retreated and ran into the second roadblock. They tried to attack and were dissolved by the withering fire of an unseen enemy. For the Americans, it was a triumph, a pure, resounding triumph. One of the officers would later write, "Our tactics work. We outflanked them, hit their rear, and made them run. We're the best." They had saved the Chinese division. They had proven their doctrine was sound. They had confirmed their elite status. But the victory was written in blood. And when the gunfire faded, the reckoning came. Dozens killed, hundreds wounded. And in these jungles, every wounded man isn't just a soldier out of commission. He is a deadly logistical problem. Carrying one man on a makeshift stretcher required 8 healthy soldiers. The column slowed. Combat effectiveness plummeted. And there were no replacements, nor would there be. They had won their first great victory and taken another step toward their own destruction. They had proven to high command that they were the perfect tool, the perfect disposable tool. NH It wasn't a strategic height. It wasn't a fortress. Just a nameless hill in the middle of an endless green ocean, which command had marked on a map. For the 2nd Battalion, under Lieutenant Colonel William Osborne, this place was supposed to be a short stop. But the Japanese had learned. They stopped chasing ghosts through the jungle. They started waiting for them at key points, and the trap slammed shut. A superior Japanese force surrounded the hill. They didn't launch a senseless frontal assault. They took up positions and began to wait for the jungle to do their work for them. First to go was the water. The only stream was covered by Japanese machine guns. Every attempt to reach it ended in death. Soon, the canteens were empty. Lips cracked. Tongues swelled in their mouths. Men began to suffer from dehydration, their thoughts clouding, their bodies weakening. They could hear the gurgle of water, so close, yet as unreachable as life itself. Then the morphine began to run out. The wounded lay in the open, under the ceaseless rain. There was no cover. The medics did what they could, but without supplies, it was like fighting windmills. And then, the worst began. The wet, warm climate was a paradise for flies. They laid their eggs in the wounds of living men. And the wounds, they teemed with white, writhing maggots. Soldiers went mad trying to clean them out, but they appeared again and again. Very soon, this nameless hill earned a name, The soldiers called it Maggot Hill. For the surrounded marauder, the world shrank to this filthy patch of earth. We're in hell. No water, no food. The wounded don't scream, they moan, and the sound never stops. God has abandoned us. This is the end. On the other side, in his foxhole, a Japanese soldier looked at the hill and couldn't understand. They are doomed. Their losses must be horrendous. But every time we attack, they fight like demons. Their tenacity is unnatural. It inspires both respect and hatred. They should have died days ago, but they keep shooting. When the last K rations were gone, Lieutenant Colonel Osborne gave the most terrible order. First, they shot their mules, the same animals that had carried their weapons, their radios, their hope. Killed them so they wouldn't fall into enemy hands. And then, hunger forced them back to the carcasses. They cut strips of meat from their fallen comrades in arms and ate it raw. They ate the animals that had brought them here, to this hell. This was the moment they stopped being an army. They became a pack. They held out for 12 days. 12 days and nights in a personal hell. Lieutenant Colonel Osborne was killed by a mortar fragment. The commander had fallen. Hope died with him. But they kept fighting, no longer for an order, not for their country, but simply out of primal stubbornness, out of hatred. When the other battalions finally broke through the encirclement, they didn't find victors. They found skeletons stretched over with skin, with madness in their eyes. The hill was retaken, but the souls of those who survived it remained there forever in the rotting earth, among the bones of mules and the unending moans of the dying. In this green hell, where courage was devalued and endurance became commonplace, the war demanded something more. It demanded asymmetrical genius, cunning that would outweigh numbers and firepower. And this weapon was found in the most unexpected of places. His name was Roy Matsumoto. Sergeant Roy Matsumoto was an American, but his face was the face of the enemy. He was a Nisei, a second-generation American whose parents had come from Japan. While he was grinding his army boots into the Burmese mud, his family, his parents, his brothers and sisters, were being held behind barbed wire in an internment camp in Arkansas. His country didn't trust him, but here, behind enemy lines, he was its most valuable weapon. At night, when the jungle plunged into an impenetrable darkness filled with whispers and crackles, Matsumoto set out on his own personal war. He left his rifle behind. His weapon was his voice. Silently, like a shadow, he would crawl toward the Japanese positions, so close he could hear their breathing, smell their cigarettes. He would lie in the mud for hours, listening. He absorbed their dialects, the way they gave orders, the names of their officers. He was becoming one of them, and when the right moment came, he would strike. In a trench, a Japanese soldier, peering tensely into the darkness, would suddenly hear the familiar, authoritative voice of his commander. Fire to the right, shift position, flank attack. The soldiers would obey. They'd open up a barrage of fire on an empty patch of jungle, giving away their exact position. And a moment later, hell would rain down on them. Precise American mortar fire, directed by Matsumoto. Elsewhere, just before an attack, with nerves stretched taut like a string, a shout would come from the darkness. Retreat! Retreat! We've been outflanked. Panic would set in. Soldiers would abandon their positions, breaking formation. The attack would be thwarted before it even began. At headquarters, a Japanese officer would fly into a rage. Who gave that order? What's going on? Is there a traitor among us? Or are the spirits of the jungle driving us mad? It wasn't spirits. It was one man, a man who had to do twice as much as an ordinary soldier to prove his loyalty to the United States. My language is as much a weapon as my rifle, he thought, pressing himself into the earth. Every enemy plan foiled, every comrade saved. This is my answer to this injustice, my answer to those who are holding my family in a camp. His exploits bordered on the fantastic. He would single-handedly infiltrate enemy camps, eavesdrop on conversations, and return with priceless information. He was the eyes and ears of the entire unit. His quiet voice in the darkness saved hundreds of lives, sowing chaos and mistrust in the enemy ranks, who began to fear not only American bullets, but their own shadows. In this war of survival, the ingenuity of one man, driven by deep personal pain, became the key that unlocked the door to victory, time and again, in a place where it seemed only death remained. When the survivors of the siege of Npomga descended from Maggot Hill, they were different men. The emptiness in their eyes was deeper than any wound. They had survived, but they had left something important, something human, back there on that cursed high ground, among the mule bones and rotting bodies. This descent was not just a return, it was a transformation. Captain Charlton Ogburn, an intellectual officer observing his men, realized this change with horror. He looked at them and didn't recognize them. The by-the-book discipline was gone. The clean collars and brave smiles were gone. Even the last vestiges of civilization were gone. They were replaced by something primal, something ancient. They looked like scarecrows, dressed in tattered rags, filthy, unwashed, with long matted beards. Their skin was yellow from atabrine, the anti-malaria drug. A feverish, unhealthy glint burned in their eyes. They moved slowly, conserving every gram of energy, but at the slightest threat, their reaction was lightning fast, animalistic. I look at my men, Ogburn wrote, and I realize we were no longer soldiers of the American army. We were a tribe, a primitive tribe, surviving in this primitive world. Our only goal became survival. Our only law became the law of the pack. They stopped talking about home, about girls, about the future. Conversations became short, functional. Ammo, water, enemy. They ate in silence, ravenously, like beasts, afraid someone would take their meager portion. They learned to sleep on the march, placing a hand on the shoulder of the man in front. They became a single, suffering organism, driven by one instinct alone, to keep moving forward. Medics in the rear area hospitals, where the wounded marauders were occasionally brought, said you could recognize these soldiers immediately. They were unlike the other wounded. They didn't complain. They didn't scream. They were silent, looking right through you, as if you weren't even there. Their wounds were horrific, but the most terrifying thing was their empty, burned-out eyes. There was nothing in them. No fear, no pain, no hope. Only an endless, all-consuming exhaustion. Captain Ogburn, a Harvard graduate who saw the war as a tragic but noble mission, watched this transformation with cold horror. He understood that the jungle was winning. It wasn't just killing their bodies. It was erasing their personalities, their culture, their very selves. It was turning soldiers of a liberation army into savages, no different from the enemy they had come to fight. This wasn't just a war for territory. It was a war for the right to remain human, and they were losing it. In this kingdom of despair, where death by a bullet was considered easy, the most terrifying fate was to be wounded. A bullet didn't kill you outright. It turned you into a burden, a living piece of cargo that slowed everyone down. They would put you on a makeshift bamboo stretcher and carry you, 8, sometimes 12, able-bodied soldiers, desperately needed in a firefight, were turned into bearers, and you would lie there, bouncing with every step, staring up at the indifferent gray sky, knowing that with every hour, your chances were fading. You knew that if the unit was ambushed, you would most likely be left behind, not out of cruelty, out of necessity. And then, just when you had said your goodbyes to life, when the fever from infection was blurring reality with delirium, you would hear it. At first, a barely perceptible drone, a vibration in the air. You thought it was the fever. But the sound grew louder, more insistent. It cut through the green canopy of the jungle. It was the sound of an engine. For a wounded marauder lying in the mud, that sound was the voice of God. He would force himself up on his elbows, scanning the sky. And then it would appear. Not a giant C-47 transport dropping supplies from a safe altitude, but a small, single-engine plane, a fragile dragonfly, an L-5 Sentinel. For a pilot from Philip Cochrane's 1st Air Commando Group, it was routine, a deadly routine. The runway was any patch of mud cleared by the soldiers in the jungle. A strip barely longer than the plane itself, littered with tree stumps and mine craters. Every landing was a risk. Every landing could be the last. Japanese snipers were just waiting for this moment. But when you see their faces, one of the pilots recalled, when you pull a guy out of that mud who had already given up on life, you realize that your job is the only miracle in this war. And so the wounded soldier, who thought he would die here in this mud, saw this miracle land right in front of him. The landing was rough, a jolt. The door opened, and he saw a face, an American face, not emaciated, not covered in sores, clean. It was a face from another world. They carried him into the cramped cockpit, and in that moment, the pain took a back seat. One pilot would never forget it. They brought me a guy with a missing leg, and he was trying to smile, saying, "Thank you." For that, the risk was worth it. The plane would race down the short strip, barely lifting off the ground, clipping the treetops. And below, under the wing, the green hell that had just tried to devour you turned into nothing more than a green map. And you knew you had escaped. You were flying toward life. These pilots were more than just airmen. They were the only thread connecting them, this tribe forgotten in the jungle, to the world they came from. They were the only hope that descended from the heavens. They were angels on the runway. May 1944. The end of the road. The goal, for which they had been thrown into this hell, was close. The airfield at Myitkyina, the only all-weather airfield in all of northern Burma, the key to victory. And to take it, they would have to make one last superhuman effort. 100-kilometer push through the Kumon Mountains, along trails that even the locals considered impassable. This was no longer a march of soldiers. It was a procession of the living dead. The soldier marching in the column no longer remembered what day of the week it was. He couldn't remember the last 3 days. His legs moved on their own, automatically. Left, right, left, right. He stared at the back of the guy in front of him. A tattered, dirty uniform shirt and the straps of a rucksack. That was his entire universe. His only thought was, don't fall behind. Don't fall down. Because whoever fell stayed down. Their bodies were at their limit. Amoebic dysentery had turned their intestines into a bloody mess. Every few hundred meters, the column would halt, and the soldiers would collapse to the ground, powerless. Scrub typhus and malaria brought on fits of fever. The men walked on, shaking with chills, with temperatures near 40 degrees Celsius. Their minds were melting. They were delirious on the march, talking to shadows, seeing the ghosts of fallen comrades. They no longer felt hunger or thirst, only a dull, endless pain throughout their bodies and an all-consuming apathy. They walked, staggering from weakness. Their eyes, sunk deep in their skulls, burned with an unhealthy fire. The only thing that still forced them forward was the order, and a promise that after Myitkyina, it would all be over, that they would be taken home. In his diary, found later, a Japanese soldier would describe them in this exact way. Another American attack. They keep coming, even when we mow them down with machine guns. They don't scream banzai. They are silent, and that is the most terrifying thing. Their faces are gaunt, their eyes are burning. They look like hungry demons. They waded through freezing mountain rivers, holding their rifles above their heads. The water washed the dirt from them, but it couldn't wash away the exhaustion. They scrambled up sheer, slippery slopes, clinging to tree roots, falling and getting up again. They abandoned everything that wasn't vital. Spare ammunition, rations, even blankets. Weight was the enemy. On May 17th, 1944, they reached the outskirts of the airfield. They had done it. They had made it through the mountains, through disease, through their own death. They stood at the edge of their goal, a handful of ragged men swaying in the wind, living dead, ready for one last attack. What came next no longer mattered. All that mattered was getting there, and they got there. May 17th, 1944. Dawn over Myitkyina. For the Japanese garrison guarding the airfield, it was an ordinary morning. They knew the Americans were somewhere in the jungle, but the Kumun Mountains were considered an impassable barrier. An attack from that direction was impossible. It was an axiom of military science. But the marauders hadn't read the textbooks. The attack began without an artillery barrage, without the roar of tanks. It began with a silence that suddenly erupted in a storm of gunfire. From the jungle, from the direction no one could have come from, they poured out. The living dead. For the Japanese command, it was a tactical failure. Unbelievable. Inexplicable. A sudden attack from a direction considered impassable. The garrison was caught by surprise. The enemy acted with fanatical determination. This wasn't determination. It was the last effort of a dying organism. Soldiers who could barely stand found the strength to run. They didn't scream. They rasped. They fired on the move, changing magazines with trembling hands. They fell, got up, and ran again. This was an attack by men who had nothing left to lose. Absolutely nothing. The fight was short and furious. The stunned garrison couldn't mount a proper defense. They fired back, retreated, and within a few hours, it was all over. A surviving marauder, standing in the middle of the runway, couldn't believe his eyes. The bodies of the enemy lay all around. Equipment was burning. And silence. An unbearable, deafening silence after the battle. We did it. We took the damn airfield. Now it's over. Now they'll take us home. We won. Colonel Charles Hunter, who had taken command after Merrill's evacuation, stood on that same runway and looked at his men, at what was left of them. A handful of ragged men. Their faces were black with gunpowder and grime. Their clothes hung in tatters. They didn't celebrate. They didn't embrace. They just sat down on the ground, right where they stood. Some fell asleep right there, clutching their rifles. Hunter saw that they had just performed a miracle, an impossible feat, but he also saw that this was their limit, the last drop of strength squeezed from their exhausted bodies. They had carried out their orders. They had paid for this victory with everything they had. In that moment, the euphoria of victory was short-lived. It was replaced by a heavy, all-encompassing exhaustion. The soldiers looked to the sky, expecting to see the transport planes that would take them out of this hell. They were waiting for the reward for their heroism. They were waiting for the promised return home. They had won, but they were standing on the edge of their own grave, and they didn't know yet that High Command was already preparing to push them into it. The story of Merrill's Marauders is not a tale of victory, but a parable about its true price. Their feat is not just a captured airfield, but proof that the human spirit can endure anything, except betrayal by those who sent it to its death. Where is the line where a soldier's heroism becomes just a number in a report, and the price of victory becomes too high to celebrate? And who decides when a single human life stops being an entire world and becomes merely expendable? Their story was buried for decades. Don't let it be silenced again. Share your thoughts in the comments, because it is in such dialogue that memory lives on. Your support, by subscribing and liking, allows us to continue telling the stories of those whose voices they tried to silence.